Welcome. Welcome to the third day of the Case for Democracy Week. This week of webinars is organized by us at the Wiedemann Institute. And over the past 2 days already, top academics have been presenting hard facts on how democracy is good for providing stable economic growth, for eradicating poverty, for social cohesion, infrastructures, and adequate health outcomes. My name is Vanessa Böse. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Varieties of Democracy Institute, and together with our Institute Director, Staffan Lindberg, I co-lead the Case for Democracy Week. You find more information on the Case for Democracy program and all its activities and publications on our website. My colleague is posting a link to this website in the Zoom chat as we speak. On social media, we use the hashtag Case4Democracy to disseminate our findings. So feel free to use our hashtag and to contribute to the discussion of democracy's dividends. At VIDEM, we brought this program to life to gather the benefits of democracy that have been established across a range of different research fields and to communicate them to policymakers and practitioners so that they in turn can make a case for democracy based on scientific facts. And therefore, I'm honored to welcome a large number of policymakers and practitioners to this webinar from a large number of international, multilateral, and non-governmental organizations, several countries' foreign offices, and 8 organizations. I'd like to extend a special welcome to all staff from the EC and the EEAS, since this webinar series is organized with support from the EU. And therefore, we also want to keep this very interactive. We want to encourage you to ask your questions to the panelists using Zoom's Q&A tool. So, the Q&A tool, you find that down in your toolbar in Zoom next to the chat symbol. And what are questions the research community can provide answers to that support you in making the case for democracy? So this is where we want input sort of from the policymaker practitioner community. Zoom's in this Q&A tool by Zoom enables you to post questions already during the panelists' talks. And it also shows you all other questions that were asked and allows you to upvote those questions that you find particularly relevant. And then we will discuss these questions after our panelists' talks. And that brings me to our panelists. I want to extend a very warm welcome to our 3 panelists today. Scott Gates from the University of Oslo and the Peace Research Institute at Oslo, PRIO. Sira Nadalum, also from the University of Oslo and PRIO, and Monica Nalepa from the University of Chicago. Now, today, our session focuses on the effect of democracy on human, domestic, and international security. What is the effect of democracy on interstate conflict and political stability and instability in general? Is there a link between female political empowerment and peace? And what is the difference, or what is the effect of transparency, in a sense, and we'll look at it through truth commissions in post-authoritarian settings on the evolution of corruption in newly established democracies. These are some of the questions that our panelists will answer today. Now, let me turn to our first panelist without further ado. Well, actually, I'll say one more sentence. Our first panelist is Professor Scott Gates from the University of Oslo and PRIO, and from, excuse me, sorry, my Zoom just disappeared, no worries. Sorry, I'm right back. So from 2002 and 2012, he was director of the Center for the Study of Civil War, and he is also the editor of the Journal of Peace Research and the International Area Studies Review. His research centers on topics in governance, conflict dynamics, and the development consequences of warfare. And as such, today he will talk about whether and if so, why democracies rarely fight each other, and what we know of the effects of democracy on political stability in general. So, Scott, how does democracy affect political stability?
Well, I have been given this task of talking about democracy in peaceful societies, civil peace, and human security. And the plan that I'm going to talk about is I will begin with the paper that was made reference to me when I was invited, which is a paper that I co-wrote with Håvard Hegra and Tanja Ellingsen and Nils Petter Gleditsch. I'll get into that, but I'm going to focus on 2 mechanisms that are relevant for the link between political institutions and civil conflict. They're the nature of the institutions, with exhibiting democratic or autocratic tendencies. And then the second mechanism is political change and instability. And then I'll examine some criticisms of that work regarding the interaction between development and democracy, the nature of political instability, and then political measurement problems. And then I'll end with looking at current or future research. So below you can see an off print of our American Political Science Review article, which was called Towards a Democratic Civil Peace, Democracy, Political Change, and Civil War, 1816 to 1992. This was published in 2001. We only look at wars, and we didn't have as good a data on conflict. Civil War data was generally ignored at this point in time. Most analysis and quantitative work on war and peace was between states, and big issue during the 90s was the notion of a democratic peace, of democratic countries not fighting each other. And we turned the lens inside countries to look at whether they were more stable than others. And we focused on two mechanisms: political institutions regarding the degree of democracy and autocracy, and political change. So looking first at democratic and autocratic political institutions, we come with first is an observation that in highly repressive regimes, the chances that collective political action, peaceful or violent, will succeed are negligible, and the costs are going to be really high. So we would expect in a highly repressive regime, no political action. And in contrast, in a liberal democratic regime, then there's more of an open society. There are peaceful collective action is tolerated and accepted. Processes of elections are indeed one of them. And we wouldn't expect a violent political action there either. Where we would expect it is what we label semi-democratic, or you could call them semi-autocratic regimes. They're the ones that are neither consistently autocratic in their composition, nor are they consistently liberal democratic in their composition. Somewhere in between. They may have some aspects of democracy and some others, or they're somewhere in between. And what we notice there is that those we would expect theoretically that peaceful collection action is not guaranteed to be successful, but the violent actions are this less repressive regime, and yet it's not fully open for registering the needs or interests or grievances of the populace. And therefore we expected violent political action to occur there. We also spend more time on political change and stability, and that is that political change and instability provide opportunities and motivation for irregular or non-institutional political change. This is a table of our analysis, and I highlight that the two variables that are theoretically postulated by us, proximity of regime change, was both highly statistically significant with very low p-value, and the marginal effect is quite high. And similarly, we take, because we're looking at an inverted U, the high levels of autocracy and high levels of democracy would expect to have low levels, and in the middle, so we take a square term, and again, we see a high statistical relationship. And we have a number of control variables that I don't have a time to get into. We drew a picture out of our results, and I want to highlight here. You can see the U shape. This is the scale of democracy, and in the middle is the highest risk. We also take years, so we're taking into account time and level, and we see this inverted U or parabolic relationship persist at the beginning of the regime, and then over time, then the the persistence. We see a persistence of instability even many years after a regime change. So we see regime change is causing high levels, and we also see the structure of the political system. So we see both level and change related to the risk of civil conflict. We also look at the degree of change, and here on this axis is the index of before regime change and after regime change. You can still see this U shape for along the dimension that we're talking about, and we see it similarly here with this here, and we see a giant mountain. This mountain up here would be in cases where we would have a high democracy retrogressing, moving in a bad direction, and where we postulate and we find that the best and safest way, more stable and least likely to produce armed conflict, is big changes, to hop from high-level autocracy over to a reasonably high level of democracy. South Korea did not follow that path. It took a slow but very risky pathway as it moved from a high-level autocracy over to a democracy in the periods over the 1980s. So in summary of that article, democracies and non-democracies have low predicted risk of internal conflict. Semi-democracies exhibit considerably higher risk of civil war. Countries with recent changes to political systems have higher risk of internal conflict, and big reform towards democratization is better than small steps in terms of risk of conflict. And even though I didn't go into it, we did control for economic development. Indeed, we even controlled for a nonlinear effect on economic development. Nevertheless, we were critiqued, or some people critiqued, all analyses of a democracy and or political institutions and the propensity for civil conflict, arguing that there was a interaction between democracy and development. And the argument was democracy reduces risk of conflict only in middle and high income countries. Development increases the risk of conflict only in conjunction with democracy, and the implication for the studies of conflict reducing effects of democracy and development go hand in hand. And this is a table that comes out of Collier and about 12 other co-authors on breaking the conflict trap, but it shows quite an interesting relationship where low income democracies are more at risk, whereas income does not affect the propensity for non-democracies to be engaged in civil conflict. And so the argument is democracies' pacifying effects in terms of civil conflict is in the middle and higher income, but not at the low income levels. Another critique had to do with a operationalization of political instability and opportunity. So why and what are the manner by which political instability would lead to conflict? Gleditsch, this is Christian Gleditsch and Andrea Ruggeri, co-authored a piece where they focused on political opportunity structures and the leader entry and stability as measures of political opportunities. And this is a result of state instability. They look at all the factors we looked at in terms of the political structures, but there was a big focus on leader entry and exit from power. And they differentiate regular, which would occur through voting, and irregular, which would be via coup or something like that. And they regard irregular entry as political opportunity. And in their analysis, they chart the risk using the hazard functions of irregular entry and regular entry. And what you find is right after the coup, very, very high risk associated with irregular entry. It declines with time, but we see for up to around 3,000 days after the irregular entry, as opposed to a regular election. And you can see for those who have regular entry into the position, it's quite stable across the 10-year period. In other words, irregular entry creates great instability and problems related to conflict onset. In summary, they're looking at opportunities for violence emanates from political instability and weak leaders, and it is willingness for violence that stems from restricted opportunities regarding political participation and advancing political claims. In other words, these are the two factors that were related to our initial argument that related to the structure itself. Then finally, there was a problem in the measurement by the polity coding, which was the data that we used at that time. And basically, the problems with that, rather than getting into too much detail about it, was that semi-democracies inherently involved factional politics and, in a sense, were coding violence, more violent regimes as semi-democracies. Well, that's kind of a problem when you're looking at civil conflict. So the answer to that is actually the VDEM project. And Fjelde, Knudsen, and Nygård recently, just in IASR, the International Studies Review, ISR, published a piece in which they disaggregate VDEM into political institutions, looking at vertical constraints, that is the link between the public and the government, and then horizontal constraints, which are interinstitutional constraints. What they find, this produced in this heat map, is that we find evidence of this parabolic relationship. This is the peak, and what we find is it's quite close to the middle on horizontal, which is pretty much what we measured in our study. But in this dimension, looking at the links between the public and the government, then we see it much more on the low side at the peak here, and then this red is lowlands are safe, and this is the peak. And so we see very high evidence of the curvilinear relationship that was postulated originally by us. In future research, I think more along the dimensions that Fjeld, Knudsen, and Nygård were focusing on, and that is disaggregation of the different types of political institutions. Rather than aggregating into single dimensions, it's better to differentiate and thereby differentiate different mechanisms that are associated with heightened conflict risk. Moreover, we need to do a lot more studying of different political constellations. Work by myself, by Knudsen and Nygård in another paper, and by Legleditch and Rougarie looking at political stability indicates that there's a relationship between structure and instability. And in that regard, if we're going to understand risks of civil conflict, we need to be looking at pathways. One, which is a direct institutional pathway to the risk of conflict, but the other is institutional configurations that lead to instability, which in turn then lead to conflict. And so we find a very big endogenized system. And so far, we have very little research that's systematically examining this system's approach, looking at both institutions and the change and instability associated with those as they relate to heightened institutional or civil conflict. In future, we need to be integrating political institutions, development, and another is just the strength of the state and its ability to be resilient and sustainable over the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Let's lead it right over to our next panelist, Sirianne. Sirianne Dalum is an associate professor at the University of Oslo and senior researcher at CREO. Her research examines why and when citizens develop preferences for democracy and dictatorship, and when they will challenge political leaders and regimes through actions such as nonviolent and violent mass protests. In recent work, she also explores the effects of female empowerment, for example, on economic growth or on peace, And it is the latter link that she will talk about today. We're very happy to welcome you, Sirianne, and looking forward to your talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Vanessa. I hope you can all see my screen now. And thank you very much to the VDEM Institute and to both Vanessa and Staffan in particular for putting together this webinar with a very exciting program. I'm very happy to get to participate in this. So in my presentation, as Vanessa mentioned, I will shift the focus towards another aspect of democracy and representative institutions, namely the extent to which women are politically empowered and get to participate in politics and influence decision making. And as I would say, female empowerment is certainly a goal that we should strive for in itself, but female empowerment is also linked to several other good outcomes, such as human development, health. It's been linked to economic growth, as well as civil conflict. And today's presentation, I'll present a couple of findings from very recent studies that try to look more closely at whether female empowerment really is conducive to peace, and if so, how. So as you know, this Women, Peace and Security agenda, as well as this United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, have been very influential among policymakers, among international organizations, and also in academia. This agenda seems to build on an assumption that women's empowerment is in some ways conducive to peace. And for this reason, quite a lot of effort has gone into bringing women into peacemaking processes and also empowering women and girls in societies more generally, particularly in war-prone societies. I think this speaks to sort of the importance of having solid, robust evidence on how and to what extent women's empowerment really is related to peace. One thing we do know is that there's a clear correlation between women's empowerment and peace. So there's many different ways of showing this, but in this figure we see the VDEM's Female Political Empowerment Index on the y-axis and the year a country has experienced civil war on the x-axis, basically showing that societies and countries where women are more politically empowered also tend to be much less exposed to civil war. But it's very difficult based on this kind of correlation to conclude on whether women's empowerment is really conducive to peace. There could be many different other factors, of course, that characterize these societies where women are empowered. For instance, related to, they could be economically developed, highly educated, maybe they have a kind of culture or norms that both make women more empowered and that also tend to produce peace. And this is part of the motivation behind these studies that I will talk about today. So first, they look at whether female political empowerment really does lead to reductions in war. And second, if so, why is that the case? And the second question is particularly important because there are many different channels through which we could imagine that female empowerment does lead to peace. And here I will talk about two that we also find some evidence of in the studies I will show in a second. And the first has to do with whether women are represented in the political system, for instance, as representatives in the legislature or represented through suffrage or through participation in civil society. And this mechanism builds on the notion that when women become more represented in politics, they will shift society in a more peaceful direction, which again builds on the assumption that women tend to have more preferences for peace than men do. This could be, for instance, because women are born with some kind of ingrained disposition towards peace, or it could be because women tend to grow up based on these expectations about women being more oriented towards peace and oriented away from using violence. So this mechanism basically assumes that when the more women enter politics and have an influence on politics, the more peaceful societies will become. The second mechanism is less concerned with women entering politics, but it's is concerned with the culture and norms of societies where women are able to enter politics. So the notion is that some societies are more sort of macho oriented when it comes to their norms, while other societies are have more gender equal norms and attitudes. So it could be the case that in these kind of societies, women can both enter politics, but these societies are also more peaceful in a sense. So it's really about the norms and culture of just everyone in society, rather than the fact that women are more represented and have different preferences. So the first piece of evidence I want to talk about is based on a study by myself and a colleague at the University of Oslo and PRIO, entitled Peace Above the Glass Ceiling. And all the technical details from this paper you can look up if you're interested. But it basically maps developments in female political empowerment and civil war for most countries in the world over 200 years. And to measure female empowerment, it draws on different indicators from VDEM. And VDEM has a lot of different indicators on female empowerment, which allows us to both measure sort of more top-down aspects of female empowerment, so to what extent women are represented in parliament, for instance, but also more bottom-up aspects, such as whether women are participate in civil society, whether they're represented in journalism, whether they have civil rights, such as access to justice and the ability to move freely around in society. And another important aspect of this paper, the study, is that it also tries to account for all these other relevant factors that can explain why peaceful societies also tend to be more gender equal, such as socioeconomic conditions, political conditions, and particularly aspects related to norms and culture. So we draw on data from a World Values Survey to measure gender equal norms and attitudes in society. And this shows the developments in this main female political empowerment index, which we use, which combines many different aspects of female political empowerment into one index. And we see that this index has increased quite a bit from 1900 up until today. And one sort of key finding from our paper is basically that the annual risk of civil conflict is reduced as female political empowerment increases, and is also reduced quite substantially. So in this graph, so we can see the probability of conflict onset on the y-axis, and what we see is that for those societies where female empowerment is really, really low, at the lowest level, the risk of civil conflict is about 0.3. But if you look at the most societies where women are most empowered, the risk of civil conflict is very close to zero, actually. So the effect is quite substantial. And I also want to remind you that we also spend a lot of time trying to account for other potential factors that may explain this. And our findings hold up to these different estimation procedures. And the second question, of course, is why do we find this? And I think there are three sort of interesting findings that I want to mention here. So the first is that it seems as if only bottom-up representation of women is related to peace. So we only find evidence that civil society participation for women and a high share of female journalists is related to a lower likelihood of civil conflict. We do not find evidence that, let's say, women in the legislature is related to peace. And the second finding, as I mentioned, we want to try to sort of distinguish between this representation of women mechanism and this norm mechanism. And when also looking at evidence that looks at norms and attitudes, so sort of aspects that can measure gender equal culture, evidence that there seems to be actually both mechanisms seem to be driving this relationship. So both, that when women are more represented, the risk of civil conflict goes down. We also found that when societal norms become more gender equal, that also has a pacifying effect. And finally, and I think this is quite interesting, we also find that female representation is only really linked to conflict, to less conflict, when it's combined with gender equal norms. So these two things seem to sort of depend on each other. So if a society get a high level of female representation, but the culture is still quite macho oriented, we should not expect that female representation leads to less civil conflict. And And I'm happy to talk more about that finding in Q&A. So the second study I want to talk about briefly is a study by Barnard and colleagues. It's also quite recent, from 2020, entitled "The Suffragist Peace." And the research question of this paper is basically whether female suffrage reduces engagement in interstate wars. While our paper looked at a civil war, this paper looks at interstate war. And the argument here is, just to summarize quickly, is that we see preference shifts in the electorate when women get suffrage and thereby get the ability to vote and influence politics. And these preference shifts towards an emphasis on peace. So this is one version of this representation argument that I mentioned earlier. And just to give you a preview of the main findings, so they do find quite a lot of evidence that increases in female suffrage does lead to less engagement in interstate war. And a very interesting finding here is that they actually find that democracy is only conducive to peace if it's also coupled with women's suffrage. So if countries become sort of more democratic without suffrage, we should not necessarily expect to see a reduction in countries' engagement in interstate war. And this figure summarizes this finding. So on the y-axis of both these graphs, we see the probability of a country initiating an interstate war. And to the left here, we see that for democracies where women do not have suffrage, democracy really doesn't matter that much for conflict initiation. If anything, it kind of goes up when countries become more democratic. But if democracies also have women's suffrage, we really do see a reduction in the risk of conflict initiation as countries become more democratic. So that's when democracy matters, when women also have suffrage, it can therefore also influence politics. And just a quick word also about the mechanism. So they also draw on evidence from many different surveys and survey experiments from around the world. And they document that in all these studies, we see this pattern suggesting that women are, on average, less supportive of using violence, less supportive of using force. So this speaks to the mechanism, sort of why we should expect to see that suffrage reduces conflict, because we really do see that women have different preferences, and there's a lot of evidence of this. So just to conclude, there are several recent studies that document that there is a very robust link between female political empowerment and different forms of peace and reductions in violence. And this seems to be due to both the representation of women entering politics, and also due to cultural change and changes in norms. And it's especially bottom-up representation that seems to matter. So just really quickly, if there are some implications of this, we should first of all expect that we should target inclusion of the grassroots level. That seems to be one important take-home point. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sirianne. Now let's turn to our final panelist today, Monica Nalepa. She's Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, and her work examines transitional justice in post-communist Europe, partisan legislatures, and game theoretic approaches to comparative politics. Her current work centers on how transitional justice mechanisms contribute to the quality of democracy. And today she will talk about how truth commissions in post-authoritarian settings affect the evolution of corruption in newly established democracies. Monica, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this platform, and everybody can see my screen? Excellent. So this is based on joint work coming out of the Transitional Justice and Democratic Stability Lab that I lead at the University of Chicago. And what I'm going to be talking about today is how to resolve the dilemma of dealing with former authoritarian elites as well as their agents after transition to democracy, so that democracy actually stays stable. So briefly, the argument on the one hand is to punish harshly so that repression never returns. Nunca más is actually a title given to many truth commissions around the world.
Monica,
but on the other hand, there's
Monica,
yes?
Sorry to interrupt you, but it's not moving right now, the screen.
Oh, it's not moving? Okay, that probably means that I do have to get out of full screen. Can you see it now?
Yes, now we see slide 3.
Okay, and you see that slide as well?
Yeah, slide 2, perfect.
Okay, great, so I'm just gonna do it this way. On the other hand, there's fear that punishing outgoing autocrats too harshly may incite authoritarian backlash. So that is why scholars and practitioners have turned to personnel transitional justice, which is a non-punitive form of dealing with the past. However, traditionally, two forms of personnel transitional justice that are actually very different have been lumped together under one category. And to explain the difference between transparency regimes, such as lustration on the one hand, and purges on the other, I'm going to use two anecdotes. So on the left-hand side, you see two people. One of them is a famous Polish dissident, Lech Wałęsa, and the guy with a finger over his lips is Czesław Kiszczak, the chief of the communist secret police. Now, after Kiszczak died, his widow approached the Institute of National Remembrance, so an institution gathering archives of the secret political police, with a very thick file indicating that Lech Wałęsa had worked as a secret collaborator for the communist secret police just before the time that he was organizing strikes on behalf of the anti-communist dissident movement. Now, Lech Wałęsa, after the transition to democracy, had gone on to be president of Poland. So this, of course, raised suspicions whether Czesław Kiszczak had pressured Wałęsa into policy contentions. In other words, had he blackmailed him to avoid certain political decisions, threatening that he would reveal this very embarrassing compromat against him, because Poland actually had not had a lustration law at the time. So the point of lustration is to deal with secret collaborators. It's to reveal through transparency mechanisms who among persons running for office or in office had in the past collaborated with the secret police in order to avoid such corrupt activity like blackmailing presidents with information about secret collaboration in the past. Now, I'm not saying that Wałęsa was a secret collaborator or that he produced any useful information, but just that such blackmail mechanisms are plausible when there is no lustration or no transparency mechanism. Now, contrast this with purges. So this, now I'm moving to the second poster, to the second photograph here on this slide. It's actually a movie poster, which is, the movie is centered around verification commissions set up to see who among officers working for the secret police, the communist secret police, could be repurposed for the new democratic regime. So the communist secret police did not just repress dissidents in communist Europe. They also combated organized crime and large-scale federal crime. So a lot of them had actually usable skills. And these verification commissions were set up to figure out who can still be useful. So what purges do is they deal with known members and supporters of the former ancien regime. And in some instances, actually firing them and removing them from office can be harmful for the new democracy. Why? Well, they could, if fired, they could take their usable skills and use them in crime, as I demonstrate with other members of the Transitional Justice and Democratic Stability Lab. Or they could simply leave the new democratic institutions staffed with people who have no clue about how to go about their job. So my research shows that purges are actually good for democracy only if they follow authoritarian regimes that had poorly trained agents, or in other words, authoritarian regimes that were not institutionalized. So this insight has led me to collect data on transitional justice around the world and these personnel forms of transitional justice. So this is a snapshot of our data on lustration, and you'll notice that it shows trend lines for 75 countries in total. And this is just the snapshot of the data on lustration. And the blue trend lines show legislative events that moved the personnel transitional justice process forward. So actually implemented lustration, expanded the number of people undergoing lustration. And red lines show, and the lines in red show events that decrease the level of personnel transitional justice in that country. Because we've learned in the Transitional Justice and Democratic Stability Lab that transitional justice is never passed once and for all, but rather undergoes changes. And in order to actually capture this full nature of the transitional justice process in these 75 post-authoritarian countries that have transitioned to democracy since 1946, we've created several measures. So the first two that I'm going to explain with several graphs are severity and urgency. So severity is essentially how much of the events, how many events move the the transitional justice process forward as opposed to backward, how severe it is. Urgency is how quickly the country in question goes about implementing transitional justice. So this graph here shows severity against urgency of truth commissions, which are also actually transparency mechanisms. And the dots here represent countries on these two dimensions. And here in red, you see Spain. Okay, so what do we know about Spain? Well, we know about Spain that it waited a very long time to actually deal with the Franco past. Following the departure of General Franco, it decided to seal its archives and adopted an informal pact of forgiving and forgetting. However, we see that despite this very delayed process of transitional justice, when it comes to severity, it actually caught up to the rest of the pack and had a pretty severe Truth Commission process. Let's look at two other countries, Tunisia and Poland. Tunisia and Poland are, and this time I'm showing you illustration. Tunisia and Poland are actually similar to one another in many respects. They're homogeneous countries. They were the front runners of the pack of their respective transition to democracy waves. Poland was first, Tunisia was first. And they did not rush to implement illustration. They're pretty low on urgency. And they were sort of like middle of the pack on severity. There was an important difference, however, between Tunisia and Poland. Namely, Poland had a very volatile illustration process. It went back and forth. It expanded illustration, it decreased illustration. And it was also very uneven when it comes to implementing illustration across different sectors of society. So for instance, the judiciary was largely exempted from illustration. Every time illustration law would be passed against the judiciary, the Constitutional Court would strike it down. I'm mentioning it because this gave an extremely good pretext for PiS and Jarosław Kaczyński to, upon coming to office, start limiting the power of the judiciary and implementing very drastic judicial reforms. He used the pretext that he is carrying out decommunization of the judiciary. So volatile transitional justice processes can also be very dangerous for the stability of democracy, as the Polish example illustrates. I'll skip Bolivia and I'll talk about Bolivia and South Africa very briefly because I'm almost running out of time. Bolivia, as you probably haven't heard about transitional justice in Bolivia because they hardly did anything. But this graph shows urgency on the horizontal axis and volatility on the vertical axis. And what you will see is that Bolivia had actually a very urgent Truth Commission process. It implemented a Truth Commission and then very promptly closed it down. So on severity of Truth Commissions, Bolivia is very low, but it did implement it very urgently. And here I showed South Africa, which is the quintessential Truth Commission process. Very briefly, South Korea, since Scott mentioned it. So South Korea, and this time I'm talking about purges. So in the last minute of my presentation, I'm going to talk about purges. South Korea had a very highly institutionalized authoritarian regime. So if you recall from the theory I presented earlier, purges here would not necessarily be recommended, with one exception. If a former authoritarian regime had an institutionalized unit of the military that was very loyal to the dictator and hence would be unlikely to be useful for the New Democrat, then that purge would be warranted. And this is in fact what happened with the group of the Hanhoi. That was a military unit united with the dictator Park because they went to the same military together. So here we see in South Korea that leadership purge severity is actually low, with that one exception of the Hanhoi. Let me just end with the last graph on South Korea, this time showing the effect of truth commissions. So this is, and this time actually showing what this implies for democracy. So this shows the effect of transparency in the form of a truth commission on political corruption, and political corruption comes from the VDEM index. So the solid line here shows South Korea from the beginning of its transition to democracy. The vertical line here shows when it was treated with a truth commission. So when the truth commission actually went into, when there was a first positive truth commission event. And the dashed line here is a synthetic control for Korea. So a synthetic control is essentially a country that we've artificially created to be as similar to South Korea as possible on all relevant in all relevant respects for political corruption, except that it did not have a truth commission. And what we see here is that indeed, there are other predictors of political corruption. South Korea does depart from its synthetic controls, but after the treatment with the Truth Commission, it does go the level of political. Sorry, this is actually the reverse scale of political corruption. So the level of democracy, so the reverse of political corruption, goes significantly up in South Korea, and in its synthetic control, it goes down. And we can show similar dynamics with. On a broader set of countries, and we do so here for illustration. This comes from my World Politics article with Milena Ang, and we can also show similar dynamics for purges. However, we do have to control for that level of institutionalization. And you can read all about that in the book that I'm writing currently, called After Authoritarianism, Transitional Justice and Democratic Stability. So I'll end there to not go over time and leave room for questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Monica. Yeah, actually, thank you for 3 very, very insightful presentations. We'll now head over into the Q&A part, and I just want to take a second to remind everyone in the audience to keep posting questions in the Q&A. I see we already have one, but I'll give you a bit more time to think about possible questions and post them in the Q&A tool, and just direct a first question to the 3 panelists here. And especially with respect to our audience here, having policy practitioners from all over the world, what are your main takeaways really now about the benefits of democracy in terms of contributing to the SDGs? So to SDG 16, we had it listed in the program on peace, justice, and strong institutions, and SDG 5, gender equality and female empowerment. What are the key takeaways you can sort of give us in the audience from your presentations? Siriana, if you want to just say.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a very important question, of course. I mean, I think the first point to be emphasized here is that sort of this notion that not only is it democracy, but bringing women into political institutions and empowering women has some kind of effect on peace, and that it should reduce to both countries and also individuals' engagement in political violence, has sort of, you know, as I already talked about, received quite a lot of influence sort of in policy making, and also it's something that, a notion that I think a lot of people have sort of believed in. But I think what is important that the 2 studies I discussed today are sort of, I think they present the most robust evidence that we have to date, that there is actually a relationship both at the country level and also at the individual level between sort of women's representation in particular, but also about these kind of gender equal norms and attitudes, because these studies try to account for, let's say, other factors that may be driving this relationship in a much more thorough manner that previous studies haven't. So I think it's just sort of what the key take home point for my presentation is that there's now even more robust evidence in favor of this thing that we thought we knew, but that we now know probably even more. And the second is probably that, so why democracy, all these different studies have suggested ways in which democracy may be conducive to peace. But I think one important point to be emphasized from my presentation as well is the fact that democracy may not be enough in itself, at least sort of just having some kind of level of democracy representative institutions may not be conducive to peace if it's not combined with female suffrage. That's one of the studies that I showed today suggests this, that if women, for instance, do not get access to political institutions and get influence on political decision-making, transitions to democracy may not really have these kind of peaceful effects that we should expect. So you also have to look at the combination of institutions that go into democracy and democratic institutions.
Thank you. Monica, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I actually had a remark that I was trying to make to Sirian's presentation, but I realized that we can't ask questions. But so can I do that? Can I use the phone? So one of the questions I had was Dawn Teal published a book last year about female suffrage around the world, and what she found is that voting rights are expanded to women less for normative reasons, but more when it actually serves the purpose of existing parties in an office. So I was wondering if that is something that Surian is taking into account. In other words, is this work just about the consequences of suffrage, or also about the consequences that are sort of moderated by the implementation of suffrage? And second thing that I wanted to ask her is if she's ever looked at the combination of women's empowerment and transitional justice, because I just thought, while she was presenting, that there's some very interesting synergy that could be exploited from our joint data sets.
Siriani, do you want to answer right away, and then we'll come back to the main takeaways after you answer?
Yeah, perhaps just quickly. So, I mean, this study that looked at suffrage is not my study, but it's a study that recently came out in International Organization, a very excellent journal. But I think so. I definitely agree with you that I think it's not only about sort of getting suffrage, but also about suffrage is implemented, if I understood you correctly. It's also how it's carried out. It's also whether it's, I guess, combined with the necessary civil liberties for women in order for that suffrage to actually make sense and be meaningful, that it can actually translate into political influence as well, not just having a sort of formal suffrage. And this study looked sort of mainly at the, I think, formal introduction of suffrage. But these are things that sort of we can look more into, especially including with VDEM data that has more information on these kind of civil liberties. And different civil liberties is something we looked at quite a bit in our study. So women's political liberties and civil liberties that are sort of protections from, I guess, political institutions' interventions in women's life, and also gives women the freedom to both organize and participate in both politics and society, which are very important, again, in order to make suffrage actually translate into meaningful political influence.
Thank you. Monica, do you want to just sum up your main takeaways for the benefits of democracy in terms of transitional justice?
So the main takeaway is to put an accent on transparency regimes and not necessarily punitive actions, such as, but not just criminal trials, but also to use purges sparingly and only when there are two conditions satisfied. And those two conditions would be that the previous authoritarian regime was actually poorly professionalized or poorly institutionalized, and or the former authoritarian leader had a close ideological following from his agents of repression. In other circumstances, extensive purges and the closing down of authoritarian agencies may result in, at best, the poor implementation skills of the new democracy, at worst in an increase in organized crime.
Thank you. Scott, what's your main takeaway on the interstate piece?
On SDG 16?
Yes.
Okay. My view is that it coincides highly with what Siriana is talking about. And I guess what I would like to emphasize here is that empowerment of women is coinciding with many other liberal institutions. There's going to be a high correlation with accounting for minority rights and minority protections, which are integral to providing a stable and secure set of institutions that will be useful for maintaining peace in the long run. Also, what is not covered, and partly because for statistical analysis it's quite difficult and there's quite controversy, but there's something to do with the composition and the nature of political institutions, but there's also the degree to what kind of their resilience and stability, and one could call it state strength or something like that. And it's an omitted variable that is obviously lurking behind the scenes. What we've seen with democratic backsliding is that even in rich and developed countries, there can be aspects of democratic backsliding with the growth of populism and the erosion of liberal liberal protections against minority groups. And all of those are quite alarming, and I think demonstrate the focus for SDG on that S, on the sustainability of the institutions and the institutional frameworks.
Yes. So with that, I'll turn over to questions from the audience. And here again, I'll encourage everyone in the audience to keep posting your questions. I'll start with more of a comment from Mansoub Murshid, actually, who's commenting on the Heger et al. Paper and talking about another paper where they find that routine or non-political violence also follows an inverted U-shape in terms of human development indicators, especially education. So in other words, more education generates more violence, and after a threshold, then violence declines. And the same applies to regional per capita income. So how does that speak to your findings?
Absolutely. We did account for a parabolic nonlinear relationship in terms of economic development. The correlation with education, especially with secondary education, and even the extent of the population that receives primary education are highly correlated with income. So we're going to see these similarly tracking. I will note that the parabolic relationship in the whole scheme of a spectrum on education or in terms of income is the peak is rather low if you consider the whole scale. It's not in the middle, which is more or less what we're finding in terms of the horizontal constraints that we see in VDEM or in the kind of the middle of the scale if you use polity. But with economics in terms of income and in terms of education, or if we want to consider those aspects of development, it's on the low side. It's more like the low and the high lows and not between the lows and the middle income.
Yeah. And I'm just going to sneak in a question of my own here, actually. And my question comes from one of the first webinars that we had with Rohini Panda, where she argued that if we really want democracy to work for the poor, we really have to tackle those democracies that are sort of semi-democracies or electoral democracies that are sort of not yet fully developed in all respects, that still lack, for example, a bit of state capacity or constraints on the executive. And she said, if we really want to help the poor in a sense, then we need to keep building those democratic institutions, making them, strengthening them. So in that regard, I was wondering to you, especially Siriana and Scott, what would you agree in that regard, calling for strengthening democratic institutions, and what sort of effects would that bring with it in terms of conflict risk reduction?
Well, I actually think that we're moving into not purely liberal democracy, but moving into social democracy, if one was to consider that argument, where other needs and other types of protections rather than just classically liberal rights are at stake. I guess it almost is, in my mind, a little bit beyond. I mean, we're talking about beyond what I'm talking about. The question about whether that leads to civil conflict or not is another issue. I mean, there may be other reasons for helping the poor rather than just because it's going to cause civil conflict.
That is true. Siriana?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the Scott says for sure, because I think the research that I talked about today, I think one thing it suggests that I think speaks to your question is that how important it is to give sort of those voices that have the most to lose from conflict, including women, because you see that women are often affected the most by conflict, both sort of violence and also the economic costs, to secure that those voices also are heard in the political decision making. And that is also, of course, a question of how democratic institutions are, but also a question of how inclusive those institutions are when it comes to bringing in all the different voices, again, including those voices that are affected the most. Because we see now that in these studies that sort of suffrage women, giving women the right to vote, but also particularly sort of women's grassroots participation, let's say in civil society organizations, in journalism, so which is one way of I guess highlighting the consequences of war to sort of citizens in a society. These are really important to avoid civil conflict, because you can shift political decision making in direction away from situations that may lead to both civil war and also interstate conflict.
And can I just jump in here and connect to Mansuk Mush's question that's posted in the Q&A about looking at female empowerment on the micro level and sort of getting closer, I guess, again, to the mechanisms, because he's wondering about the aggregate level and there being a danger that female empowerment is more confounding sort of at the aggregate level than if you actually look at it on a micro level. How much, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I definitely agree that it's very important to combine aggregate level data with more micro level evidence. And actually the second study I talked about today, the study published in International Organization, that actually draws on 17 different surveys or survey experiment at the micro level that basically looks at individuals, both men and women, in various settings to sort of really tease out how individuals think about political violence and when individuals will support or withdraw their support from political leaders who've shown a willingness to use violence both internally, domestically, but also engage in civil war. And with all of these micro level studies actually point in the same direction. They really speak to how much women care about the use of violence and how women tend to be much more concerned with these kind of violations than men do. And I think that speaks to sort of the one mechanism that I talked about today that has to do with the fact that maybe women have different preferences. And that's one reason why we see this aggregate pattern. When women enter politics, we also see reductions in civil war, at least on average. And these macro level findings, I think, really illuminate the mechanisms here, that it is actually perhaps about the preferences of women. So at least I think there's a lot of research that has been done out there that is still being done on the micro level that sort of support these aggregate level patterns.
Yeah. Thank you. I just want to draw your attention to a colleague by Joachim Molander from International IDEA on policymaking, and it's the following. Over the last few years, the main goal of some countries' development cooperation strategies have shifted from poverty alleviation to peace and security, partly with the purpose of counteracting migration. And so this type of research that we're doing is very important for making the case that development assistance investments in democracy contribute to that development goal. And actually, this comments like these are the reason why we're doing it. So I'm super happy to share this here with all of you and to sort of encourage this dialogue.
This is actually Paul Collier's point in the early 2000s of the conflict trap, or what he referred to as armed conflict is development in reverse. And partly it was his own observations when he's working at the World Bank, and when a number of his projects in West Africa literally went up in smoke and destroyed by wars in places like Liberia and Sierra Leone, where infrastructure and other types of development programs were utterly destroyed. I've done a number of studies with Håvard Hæggren, Håvard Strand, and Håvard Nygård on trying to assess the economic consequences and development consequences of conflict. And they're unambiguous. We looked at the Millennium Development Goals in our World Development article, and nearly all of the World Development indicators were profoundly negatively influenced by conflict, and the more severe the conflict, the greater the development consequences. Unfortunately, for sustainable development, the indicators are ironically not as good as they were for the Millennium Development Goals. I'll take an example. Potable water, drinkable water, which is the major source of infant mortality rates associated with internal displacement due to war, because you're moving out of an area with clean water and then it's accessed only to bad, dirty water, contaminated water, which makes an infant extremely vulnerable. The indicators for Millennium Development Goals were quite good. And now for Sustainable Development Goals, the official indicator is the proportion of official development assistance going towards securing clean water. It has nothing to do with access and the number of people who have access to the water. And so it's thereby impossible to do an assessment using SDG indicators in the same manner that was possible with the Millennium Development Goals. So there's a little bit of my critique of the SDG, the way it was implemented, not its plans, because I actually very much applaud what's behind SDG as a carry through from the MDGs, and the MDGs were an unmitigated success in terms of assessing the interrelationship between development goals and our findings associated with the role of conflict.
Thank you. I would like to post the next question from Marilyn Nevin from International IDEA as well. And she posted it to Sirena, but I saw that Monica wants to respond too. I'm just going to repeat it so that we all know what this is about. So Marilyn says, I wonder to which extent the results of your important research on female empowerment and peace relations have a relation with the fact that instability and war speak more to men, and they historically seem to have a stronger attraction to be actively involved, and to what extent their predominance in political power and decision-making would have an influence on average duration of the conflict of war. And yeah, so maybe Monica, if you want to just go first.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this, and you know, I don't want to answer for Sirian, but factually, actually, this is not necessarily correct. So Andrila Dubé, Professor Andrila Dubé from the Harris Policy School at the University of Chicago has a wonderful paper titled Queens, in which she shows that actually it's not the case that less violence occurs and less war and fewer wars are fought when there are female rulers, but actually more or indistinguishably different numbers of wars from men. And you know, one can speculate like what is the cause behind that. She looks at historical data. That's why I'm mentioning it. But as a social science answer to this question would be that, you know, when we think about the causes of female empowerment, they actually might stack the deck so that it's so that we're getting a somewhat skewed result. Because when do we see sort of like bursts of female presence in political institutions? We see it following regimes when females were excluded. So, what we might be comparing when we're looking at increases of female presence in political institutions are comparisons with situations where that female presence was very, very low. So the point here is that it's hard to make these comparisons in a sort of like clean and distilled way, because we often cannot just artificially produce situations where, you know, the representation of women increases by 30%. There's always there could be some cause behind that. For instance, you know, an extensive purge of the authoritarian party, which was predominantly made up of men, that frees up, you know, 30% of seats in the legislature, some of which might be taken by women. So I think as social scientists, we have to look into those possible mechanisms.
Yeah. Sirena, what would be your answer to this question and to Monica, so to speak?
Yeah, so my first point is also to pick up on Monica's first point, because I think these are really, really important questions. So we also looked at this in our study, actually. So I think you're very right that very many female political leaders have been sort of equally prone to engage in war, and maybe sometimes even more than men. And what we find in our paper is actually that female leaders and getting sort of female leaders and female representatives is only positively linked to peace if we also have a relatively gender equal culture, so relatively gender equal norms. And I think this makes a lot of sense in a way, because if a woman enters, let's say, a leadership position in a society with a mainly sort of more macho oriented culture, you would expect this woman to actually be punished by having at least traditionally more sort of female-oriented perspectives, that a woman may have to really comply to quite strong gender stereotypes, and may even have to sort of show that she's even more belligerent and willing to engage in war than a man, in order to actually get to that point where she gets elected, both elected and getting to the point where she becomes a representative candidate for these kind of positions. You have many examples, let's say Margaret Thatcher, like her Iron Woman stereotype. There are also examples such as Indira Gandhi that had to sort of at least show that they had sort of this strong position on war and were willing to be strong leaders that would sort of fight for their own country. But I think if women come to power and there's a much more gender equal culture, so you will not be punished for, let's say, emphasizing the human costs of war, then I think we would expect to see that if women have these more peaceful preferences, they would also get more influence on policy making. And again, this is to quickly mention this again, I think it's really puzzling to see all these different surveys from different contexts, from Russia, from Egypt, from Iraq, that show that women on average do tend to emphasize the costs of war more than men. And if this really is a pattern, I think we should expect that in a gender equal culture, and we can also see that these preferences among female political leaders also get an influence on politics.
Thank you. Monica, I just want to add another question just to you. And I want to go back to those micro level effects that you sort of closed with on your last slide. And I was wondering if you can say a few words again. So just to wrap this up and for us to take home, are people more likely to support and trust democratic institutions when the past is adequately dealt with, or does it, and when does it bring up old conflict lines? So when, what?
So what I would encourage people to do is to shift attention from a focus on dealing with the past for like the past's sake, and have a more forward-looking orientation towards like, how can these legacies of the past in the form of compromat and skeletons in the closet actually obstruct democratic representation. So I opened up the presentation with this, with positing this situation of blackmail with compromat, where uncovered events from the past can come to haunt the new democracy, but not because sort of like justice wasn't done in the form of retribution, but rather because they can obstruct honest representation of voters. So that very last graph that I showed showed how countries that have more severe forms of lustration actually have parties that are more representative of what the voters programmatically want. So are more likely to be implementing platforms that the voters voted them in for, and are simply more accountable to voters. So whether we take VDEM variables or whether we take variables from other surveys or other sources, the pattern is very strong that transparency is good for democracy, and just mere punishment and punitive sanctions not necessarily.
Thank you. And of course, the next question, it wouldn't be 2021 if I didn't have to ask this, or if I didn't ask this question. And I just want to put it to all of you. So with the corona pandemic in the background, and we know there's a lot of research showing that the corona pandemic affects women disproportionately rather than men. So how do you, and I'm going to post this to Siriana first, but how do you view this affecting, women's ability to participate in civil society, but also in politics? And what does it mean in terms of policy implications? What are areas that need to be strengthened?
Yeah, no, that's of course a very pertinent and important question as well. And I think, I mean, it's extremely striking, right, to see the pattern suggesting how, for instance, the coronavirus affects women unproportionately, let's say, in the labor market. I think these unemployment data from India are quite striking, showing, you know, how much it really has affected women when it comes to their unemployment level now. And I think this can influence, of course, not just sort of their position in the labor market, and to what extent they become empowered and thereby represented in the political system. But I think this is also something that can influence norms and attitudes about gender in India, because I think it's something we have seen over the past. At least there is evidence of this. At least from quite a few economics papers, suggesting that when women get employed and sort of get more economic independence, this just alter gender attitudes in society. So people then view women differently. They view the potential of women and their sort of role in society and in politics differently. And I'm just concerned that this sort of increase in unemployment may shift those attitudes backwards and maybe sort of ruin some of the improvements in gender norms that we've seen all over the world. I mean, India is still scores quite low on these kind of gender equal attitudes, but even in India we have seen some improvements. And I think this is sort of course concerning in itself, but given sort of our findings that this reduction in civil war due to women's empowerment is not only because of female representation, is only because of gender norms, and these gender norms may be potentially quite damaged by the pandemic. So that's sort of, yeah, probably the first point I wanna highlight. Let's open up for the others as well.
Yeah.
So she'll.
Maybe we've got Scott a chance.
Yeah.
Sorry, what?
Scott, do you want to jump in on that?
No, I agree with everything that Siriana said. I mean, it's unambiguous. I do think in terms of women's empowerment, but I also think what we're seeing is effects on in countries with high levels of economic inequality. We're seeing minority groups that are differentially affected as well. Those who are vulnerable in jobs where they have to use mass transportation to get to work, they cannot home office. Their jobs don't involve Zooming, where they have to go to a slaughterhouse to work at the slaughterhouse or something like that. Well, they're going to be exposed to the virus at much higher levels than people that can stay at home and aren't required to work and expose themselves. So I think it's not just women who are going to be suffering, but certain minority groups, and it's going to be more evident in equal societies than in more equitably income distributed societies. So I think there's many aspects of the corona pandemic that will have unpleasant consequences for the future that we will have to see. Hopefully they aren't as bad as what could be.
Monica, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, so I'm way out of my depth here when it comes to expertise, other than, you know, I was myself a woman who had to retreat from the workforce briefly last year when I had to homeschool my daughter. And, you know, one of the things that struck me was that this effect on women is moderated by income, by country incomes. So on the one hand, there are countries where women simply could not afford to not retreat from the workforce. Then there were, you know, there were spheres of life where women weren't working anyway, so it didn't affect them in terms of, you know, female empowerment. And then there was the middle class where you did see a very high proportion of retreats, so retreating from the workforce. So where women who you know, used to work, decided to give up their jobs, whether permanently or temporarily, and stay home. And I think that there we're going to see, to the extent that labor force participation is correlated with political independence and political behavior, we're most likely to see these effects on democratization, because women who don't participate in the workforce tend to not behave independently politically either. So this could have effects in the forms of clientelism, and all kinds of sort of like bad democratic stability indicators. But as I said, I'm out of my depth here. So these observations are from my N of one of, living through the pandemic in the United States.
Yeah. Yes, I see we have a new question in the Q&A tool, and it is especially to Siriana, how social beliefs can obstruct gender equality, particularly in countries like Pakistan. Do they need to break the power structure sort of to, I guess, establish new, more gender equal structures?
Right. I mean, so I think social beliefs and norms and attitudes, of course, definitely do obstruct both women's empowerment, but I guess also develop more general, since that tends to sort of come from increased women's empowerment. But I think it's sort of how to break this. I mean, it's very hard to change norms, especially overnight. Norms are, per definition, very sort of, they develop slowly, change slowly. But I think if there's one thing, and we already mentioned sort of employment, increased women's employment has sort of tended to, at least there's quite a lot of evidence that has tended to shift attitudes in a more gender equal direction. So I guess sort of avoiding more unemployment among women, which is very hard to do during a pandemic that disproportionately affects women, but also investing in sort of women's labor market prospects, women's education. Also education, we do know that education has a pretty strong effect on these kind of social beliefs and norms that otherwise would be very, very difficult to change. So I think, I mean, that's of course not an easy answer, but I think that is sort of at least the promising part here, that these kind of economic changes that have happened, and that probably, we will return to a society where we will hopefully at least see sort of reductions in the unemployment levels among women again, and they should, at least sort of based on what we know so far, continue to shift attitudes in a positive directions, I think. And just I also wanted to throw in one more point to your last question about sort of how the pandemic can influence both women's empowerment, but also violence. And I think it's very important to not only speak about civil war and interstate conflict, but also domestic violence. And there's a lot of evidence, of course, about how reductions in women's empowerment, but also how just the pandemic in general has led to increases in domestic violence, both due to unemployment among women, due to more unemployment among men, who then tend to stay more at home. But so many different mechanisms that suggest that domestic violence is now really something to watch out for right now. So I just also want to highlight that.
So yeah, of course, that's a valid point. I have one last question that I want to put specifically to Scott about, you've told us about this curvilinear relationships where transitions in the middle, where you go from democracy to autocracy, where you're in the middle category, it's sort of messy, but then when you come to the end, so when you come to democracy, that really reduces interstate, or the risk for interstate and civil conflict. So that in itself speaks to SDG 16, and we've talked about this. But what are the impacts on other things? So we know conflict is bad, and you talked a little bit, gave the example with the water, but what are the implications for, the developmental implications, but also for other areas?
Well, I think actually we as social scientists really need to be thinking about these endogenized relationships. If we're really going to take conflict as development in reverse seriously, to really assess what the consequences and the value of SDG 16, which I guess regards all three of our presentations. This is something that has implications for, I think, all of the SDGs, not just 5, but I would say every single one of them is associated with 16. Without an institutional basis of governance, it's going to be impossible for a country to implement SDGs. And if we're going to talk about sustainability, we need to think about the sustainability of the institutions. I think both what Siriana is contributing with regards to the gender and what Monica is talking about, and especially with regard to transitions and the movements from and towards liberal democracy, it's important to be focusing on sustainability of those institutions and preserving them. And finding democratic backsliding and possible political consequences of COVID pandemic to be quite worrying, because one of the biggest risks associated with our analysis is extreme retreat from liberal democracy. So moving backwards is much more dangerous than moving forward, if you will. So I think we need to think about the interconnection of all of the SDGs, but I think in particular working and thinking about the sustainability of the institutions that can preserve peace and obtain a long-term sustainable sense of justice.
That actually brought together everything very well and connected these three presentations very well. And given that the time is advancing and I don't see any new questions in the Q&A, I actually think this is a perfect opportunity to just extend a big thank you for me to our panelists, first of all. And then there are also a couple of other people that I would like to thank. One of them is Laura Bretea at the European Commission for her support to the Case for Democracy Week, but also the broader Case for Democracy program. And then I want to thank my colleagues behind the scenes, Natalia Natsikan, Nazifa Alizada, and Josephine Panis, who have worked hard to make this whole webinar week possible, and also my colleagues behind the scenes who've been answering in the chat and posting important information. And yeah, last but not least, let me give you a thank you to our panelists, to the audience for a lively discussion, for posting many questions, and to all of you for joining us in making the case for democracy. Thank you.